What's up, everybody, and welcome back to 115 Reading. And today I am going to do a ranking of the Stormlight Archive, and I'm excited about this because I think I have a somewhat controversial ranking of the series. I don't think my ranking is similar to pretty much anyone else's ranking that I've seen online, and either this will be a good thing and I'll find people who agree with me, or this will be a bad thing and people will say I'm the stupidest person alive for the picks that I've made. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, I don't think my pick for number 5 is going to annoy that many people. I actually think this seems to be the general consensus now that the dust has settled, but my number 5 is Wind and Truth. Now, I think it's pretty popular to kind of hate on Wind and Truth at the moment, at least among booktube circles. I don't hate Wind and Truth, despite placing it on number 5. I enjoyed quite a lot of it. I enjoyed a lot of the characters. I enjoyed a lot of the stories. I especially enjoyed the ending. I don't know if there's any specific reason for it, but I think it was just a little too slow for me in parts. I'm not really sure I liked the choice to do the 10-day structure. I feel like a lot of people say that it's too long, but I feel like because Sando chose to do it in 10 days, he felt like he had to give a bunch of details to each day, and so the whole thing stretched out. And so there's just a lot of, in my opinion, redundancy in that middle portion of the book, in those like middle days where I feel like there's a lot of like repeat things happening. For instance, like characters constantly having the same conversations about their own character development over and over. Yeah, I think it was just like that middle portion of the book, it was a little slow. I think if there weren't 10 days, I actually think, that Sando and editing team would have had a much easier time actually editing this down. Because, Brandon doesn't want to skip any days, but I really think because there's a lot of the storylines are just like, we gotta wait till we get to the 10-day mark, like Adolin, right? Or we gotta, get through these 10 video game levels in Shin, right, which is Kaladin and Szeth. I think, struggled with Kaladin's arc in this book. I pretty much loved where he was by the end of Rhythm of War, and to be honest, and maybe people disagree with me on this, I think Kaladin's arc was basically mostly done, which is fine, by the way, but because he's in so much of this book with Szeth, he's just kind of treading water until he gets to the end. But because Sando needs something for Kaladin to do, most of what Kaladin does is sit around and talk with Syl about his mental state, which is fine. It's not like that's never happened in the series before, but it's what I didn't like about it is it was very unsubtle, it was very heavy-handed, and again, it happened, I feel like once a day in the book. I can't remember, but it felt like it happened multiple times. I'm fairly confident that, like some of the other books on the list that I didn't love as much at first, but loved upon a reread, that I think Wind and Truth in time I will look much favorably upon in the future when I reread it. I'm probably not going to reread it for many years, probably not until book 6 is about to come out. But I feel like with the proper amount of distance and time from it, and with the hype of book 6, I think we'll revisit this book and we'll enjoy it a lot more. And I didn't hate it, obviously. I read it in like 4 days. So obviously I had a great time reading it and it was a lot of fun. All right, it's time to get really controversial. This is the pick that people are going to absolutely crucify me for. But my number 4 is Words of Radiance, Book 2 of the Stormlight Archive. Now, put the pitchforks down, okay? Let me explain myself. I think Words of Radiance is a great book, okay? On my first read-through, I'm just like all of you. Words of Radiance was either my favorite or my number 2. However, when I reread the series last year, Words of Radiance had one glaring problem, and all it was just a simple pacing issue. You see, at the beginning of Words of Radiance, I feel like Kaladin's storyline is very slow, and nothing really big happens until, I think I marked this, around page 300 something. And that's really all it is. For the first 300 pages, Kaladin and Bridge 4 are basically treading water with Dalinar and Adolin and getting to know them, or setting up how they're going to be guards in Dalinar's army, or taking horse training lessons, or taking sword training lessons. All their chapters are pretty much like that until around page 300 something when Szeth finally attacks Dalinar. And it's not like those chapters are unimportant. Obviously, it's important that Kaladin and his men integrate well with Adolin and his men, and that there's good conflict there and all that. It's just on a reread, that stuff was just so slow to me. Once Szeth attacks Dalinar around like the end of part 2 or something, around page 300, Kaladin's storyline picks up and it's great from there. And then pretty much no notes for Words of Radiance. Now, the good thing about Words of Radiance is I think it makes up for that, because Shallan's story from the first chapter is like hits the ground running. Now, I get it. I know a lot of people love this one because it has the arena scene, all right? And the arena scene is awesome. I think about the arena scene every day, just like you. But one scene does not make an entire good book, all right? Obviously, I do think the entire book is good. But especially what I love about Words of Radiance is the Eshonai interludes. I think those are my favorite part of Words of Radiance. They were my favorite part when I read it for the first time. I think they were still my favorite part this time. They're even more tragic now that we know more about Vinley going into Words of Radiance. And so, yeah, I mean, I loved it. I still got emotional at the end when Kaladin swears the third ideal. All that stuff was great. I just thought the first 300 pages, specifically for Kaladin, was very slow. And that is the reason that Words of Radiance went down in my ranking. All right, my number 3 is Rhythm of War. In my opinion, I think this book is the most overhated and also probably most misunderstood of all the Stormlight books. I think Rhythm of War is awesome. Now, just to be clear, on my first read through, just like most people, I initially found Rhythm of War kind of underwhelming. I thought it was very slow, it was very depressing. I felt like by the end of it, not a lot happened. However, on a reread, none of these problems are present, actually. In fact, I found that the book was very well paced the second time through. I didn't think it was that much of a slog at all. In fact, the things I looked back on and thought, man, that takes up the whole book. The things you'll hear about in other reviews. The Navani science classes take too long. The Kaladin Die Hard storyline takes up too long. And actually, what's really funny on reread is that most of the Navani science stuff happens mostly in part 4 and a little bit in part 5, right? In those last 2 parts. And the Kaladin Die Hard storyline mostly takes place in part 3 and a little bit of part 4. And what I think happened with Rhythm of War is that I think usually a lot of people, when they're first reading a book, what they think about the most is the most recent stuff that happened. And so because they had just read the Navani science stuff and the Kaladin Die Hard stuff and the Vinley flashbacks, and those are backloaded to mostly near the second half of the book, people spread this narrative that like, oh, the book is only science classes with Navani. The book is only this Die Hard storyline. There's too many Vinley flashbacks. And really, I actually just don't think that's true. In fact, on a reread, knowing all this stuff was coming, I felt like the pace was perfect. Anytime I thought, oh, I might start to get disinterested again in the storyline, we'd switch to one of the other storylines. I genuinely had no problem rereading Rhythm of War at all. I thought it was actually one of the best paced of the entire series. When I was rereading it, I could not put it down. I actually just kind of like the storylines, okay? I like the Navani and Raboniel storyline. Simply because I think Raboniel is one of the best characters in the entire Stormlight archive. And so, yes, please, give me a million chapters of Navani and Raboniel. I love Raboniel. I think she's so fascinating. I think the storyline in Shadesmar is awesome because I think up until this point, we haven't got to see Shadesmar enough. And so I loved getting an entire storyline just about Shadesmar in this one. My favorite chapter of the entire Stormlight archive series is in Rhythm of War. It is, of course, the Dog and the Dragon chapter. I think about that chapter probably every day. It has stuck with me ever since I read it. I think that chapter is a masterpiece in its own right. So yeah, Rhythm of War, it's got some of the best world building so far in the series. It's got some of the best pace. It has my favorite chapter of the entire series. It has some of my favorite characters that we never see again, like Raboniel. Man, I'd love a Raboniel novella. Give me that, please, Sanderson. I'm sorry, I love Rhythm of War. Also, if we're talking about pure aesthetics, I think Rhythm of War has the best cover in the entire series. And you can fight me on that. This cover is absolutely gorgeous. Number 2, The Way of Kings. This is the first book in the Stormlight archive. I think The Way of Kings has a bad reputation. I think The Way of Kings has the reputation of being just a world-building book, or it only gets started in the last 100 pages. I think that's false. I actually think if you go back and reread The Way of Kings, what you'll find is The Way of Kings is a very tightly plotted and very well-paced book. I don't think there's any fat on The Way of Kings. I think every chapter is important. Every chapter is serving some purpose. I think Way of Kings is interesting all the way through. I think something is happening all the way through. I think that, it is the most trim of the books, and so it feels the most fast-paced to me. I love everything about The Way of Kings. I think it's incredible. And yeah, the last 100, 200 pages are the best, but the first 600, 700 pages are really freaking good. Yeah, I feel like I should say something more about The Way of Kings, but I just think it's basically perfect, so I don't really have any notes. It's just really freaking good. All right, you guys can already know and already tell what my number 1 is, and it may be controversial, but number 1 for me is definitely Oathbringer. What to say about Oathbringer other than I think it's a masterpiece? The thing about Oathbringer is I feel like, and maybe this is hypocritical of me based on what I've said so far in my ranking, but Oathbringer maybe has the highest highs, and it's one of those books that has the highest highs and the lowest lows. You hear people talk about that all the time. And I think Oathbringer, that's probably true. However, on a reread, the lowest lows that I think people bring up are not really that low for me. Like, besides the slow section in part 2, I really have no problems, actually. A lot of the problems that people cite, the slow pace in the middle, I don't feel that way besides the bit in part 2. In fact, rereading it, I kind of enjoyed just hanging out with Bridge 4 for a while in part 2. The thing that people say is slow, where everyone gets trapped in Shadesmar, I found that part, especially in the first read too, fascinating. Because at this point, I was desperately curious to see something of Shadesmar, and so I was super thankful that we got a whole section in Shadesmar. I love that stuff in Shadesmar. I think it's really good. I don't think it's slow at all. Of course, we get some of the best flashbacks in the entire series because we get Dalinar, and if you're like me, Dalinar is like obviously your favorite character because, you know, he's Dalinar. It emotionally moved me unlike pretty much anything I had read up to that point, which is crazy because up to that point I had read The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance, which are also very emotional books, but Oathbringer takes that to a max. Even on the second read through, Dalinar's story was even more impactful than it was the first time, which is saying something because obviously I think that Dalinar's storyline lives in my head rent free. And so the fact it was even more impactful is crazy. And what's interesting about Oathbringer is that by the time I got to Oathbringer, I had already kind of figured out some twists. Like I had figured out that Dalinar had killed his wife. And even still, the reveal and the character development there hit me like a truck. I have a lot of positive memories of Oathbringer because I finished Oathbringer the night before I got married. So it means a lot to me in that sense that I associate it with that exciting time of my life. I'm just thinking about the you cannot have my pain scene, which I think is the best scene that Brandon Sanderson maybe has ever written besides the Dog and the Dragon chapter. It is so powerful and so inspirational. Everything about Oathbringer, I love. The only thing I don't like about Oathbringer is the cover. I'm sorry. I think the cover is the ugliest cover out of the entire series, and that's kind of annoying. You know why? I don't know why. This is something that I could complain about all the time. I don't know why the cover art doesn't line up with the character that's being focused on in the book. Like, why is Khaled this cover, not the cover for The Way of Kings? Because this is the Kaladin book. Why is this cover not the cover for Words of Radiance? Dalinar should be an Oathbringer. It doesn't matter, all right? If you're like me and you like just hanging out with these characters, even though it's slower, you enjoy that slow time, especially because I don't mind if something is slow leading up to an incredible ending. And I think the ending makes the slow burn of Oathbringer way more worth it than the ending did of Wind and Truth. I think the ending of Wind and Truth was a little too fast for me, but Oathbringer, you really have a long, big climax that you really get to sit and think about everything that's going on. And so that's why Oathbringer is number 1 for me, and it's pretty handy. So that's my ranking for the Stormlight Archive. I know I will get crucified whenever people eventually discover this video and they see that Words of Radiance is not number 1. I'm sorry, you can fight me. I don't care. I will stick to my ideals, and that means that Words of Radiance is lower, okay? I don't care, all right? Oathbringer's number 1. Rhythm of War is great. And one final thought before we close out, all right? Vinley actually is one of the best Stormlight Archive characters ever, and I don't care. You can come at me. Vinley is the most misunderstood and underrated character of the entire Stormlight Archive. I love her. She's one of my favorites. And that's another reason I didn't like Wind and Truth, is that, unfortunately, I also did not like Vinley's story in Wind and Truth. And I feel like that gave more fuel to the Vinley haters. And it's really annoying to me as a Vinley defender that I have to agree that Vinley wasn't great in Wind and Truth. Why'd you do this to me, Sando? I wanted to defend Vinley, but you gave her nothing to do in book 5. What gives, man? She was so important in book 4. Why'd you drop her? Whatever.